Alright, hello everybody, my name's Devin, the Albino Jackass, and today's video is a pretty special one because I've been working on it for a while now, and today being August 1st, I think it's a good day to begin this series. And today, and for the next couple of days, we're going to be looking at the history and decline and significance of American country music. And the reason I think this is important is and we'll get into this a little bit more, but I think that nothing preserves the American heritage better than traditional country music. And I do not mean modern country music, this stadium country, I guess you could call it. But to understand why it is significant to understanding American heritage, you need to understand the history of country music itself. So let's go ahead and take a little time travel adventure here. Hop in the DeLorean with me. And we're going to go back 97 years ago to 1927. Now, there was a record producer named Ralph Peer, and at this time, record companies mainly focused on classical and vaudeville music. That was the mainstay, I guess you could say. Now, a couple of years before this, in November of 1925, you had the beginning of the Grand Ole Opry. But for the most part, a good example of the kind of music that would become country music would be old-time string music. Think the band Old Crow Medicine Show. A lot of you have heard their song Wagon Wheel. That is an example of old-time string music and not bluegrass. And we'll get into the differences here in a bit, but the main difference is the banjo style. And again, we'll get into more of that here in a minute. So, beginning in 1927, Ralph Peer sets up a makeshift recording studio in an old hat factory in Bristol, Tennessee. And there were one group and one person that met in this hat factory and recorded records, and that was Jimmie Rodgers and the Carter family. And we're going to talk about the Carter family first. It was made up of A.P. Carter, his wife Sarah, and her cousin Maybelle. And Maybelle will be very important a little bit later down the road. But they go, and the first song that they record is on the 2nd day of August, 1927. And that song is Bury Me Beneath the Weeping Willow. And so I consider August 2nd, 1927 to be the birth of country music. And the Carter family was really a good example of their music. You can listen to the old Brother Where Art Thou soundtrack, Keep on the Sunny Side. A lot of Carter family songs made it onto that soundtrack, so that's a really good example of what we're talking about. Now, a lot of their songs they didn't necessarily write. A.P. Carter started out selling fruit trees in Clinch Mountain, Virginia, probably about an hour and a half from where I live. And as he was selling these fruit trees, he would eventually meet his wife, Sarah. And his brother would later marry Maybelle. Now, on these, as he was going across Clinch Mountain trying to sell fruit trees, he would also get songs that people had, been handed down through generations, and he would take them and adapt these songs and record them. So what AP managed to do by going on these song-finding trips was find and preserve a lot of the Scots-Irish folk ballads. And a lot of these songs that they recorded were 200 years old back then. So it was a wonderful snapshot of early American life brought to the public with the release of the Carter family records. That's one of the reasons it's so important, but it also laid the foundations for one of country music's most pivotal foundational pillars, I guess you could say. And that is this sort of close-knit family values. The Carter families were kind of like a musical version of the Waltons, I guess you could say. At least that's how they presented themselves. Behind the scenes was a much different story. But the significance of what A.P. Carter managed to do with finding these songs and recording them cannot be understated. A lot of the folk bands that were really popular in the counterculture movement of the 60s, think Simon and Garfunkel, Peter, Paul and Mary, who was it? The Kingston Trio, that's what I was thinking of. A lot of these guys took a lot of inspiration from the Carter family and a lot of these early country music acts. So, Keep on the Sunny Side is one of them. A lot of gospel songs were brought out, and it really, for the first time, brought to the masses the culture of the South in a way that really hadn't been done before. And so that is one of the biggest, most important things about the Carter family is what they managed to bring and lay the bedrock of country music. Wildwood Flower was probably one of their biggest songs. And the guitar riff that Maybelle came up with is probably the most replicated in country music. And Maybelle's guitar style cannot be understated in the way that she played it. She played both the melody and the rhythm at the same time. That really hadn't been done before. So it was a wonderful, wonderful way to show Southern and Appalachian culture in a way that was very authentic. And that was a big part of country music from the beginning, was authenticity. So now I'm going to talk about Jimmie Rodgers a little bit. Now, he was born in Mississippi. His father was a foreman on the railroad. So Jimmie Rodgers was a little different in the sense that he kind of harkened back to vaudeville a little bit because he played a character, the singing brakeman. Now, his most famous, I guess you could say, contribution would be the blue yodel. Yodelay, yodelay, yodelay. That would be what Jimmie Rodgers was famous for. If you want to hear what that's like, listen to T for Texas, T for Tennessee, or In the Jailhouse Now. Again, another one featured on the Old Brother Where Art Thou soundtrack. That whole soundtrack is just a good reference point for this era of country music. So, but Jimmie Rodgers was a little different in that he brought more blues influence into country music. And from this, Jimmie Rodgers helped form from what a lot of people call the white man's blues element of country music, because he went from singing songs about being a singing brakeman to singing songs about his diagnosis with tuberculosis, and thus began another pivotal part of country music, and that is things that were deeply personal. And again, this is right from the beginning. This is the first recording sessions. We still haven't left Bristol. We're still in 1927 here. So from those Bristol sessions, and the Carter family and Jimmie Rodgers was born commercial country music. And from there, it kind of stayed pretty innocent. Gospel songs and things like Bury Me Under the Weeping Willow, Keep on the Sunny Side, that was coming from the Carter family. And Jimmie Rodgers was, of course, singing songs about trains, songs about woman trouble. But it was still very folkish, I guess you could say, especially the Carter family. And it really didn't develop an edge. Now, with the onset of the Great Depression, things kind of changed a little bit. People shifted from buying records to listening to the radio, and this is really when the Grand Ole Opry began to take off, so we're moving into the 30s now. Now, when Roy Acuff is probably the first real big star that really brought the Opry to a national audience. And again, it was sort of his songs tend to focus on freight trains, innocent romances, and gospel music, sort of this old-fashioned Victorian values that country music still is kind of known for. But the thing about Acuff was he had a very, very old-fashioned mountain style of singing. And if you listen to it today, it sounds a little dated. And I love this style of music. But Acuff is a little harder to listen to, especially to a modern audience. But it's also beautiful in the fact that, again, it helps preserve this mountain, Appalachian, and Southern heritage in a way that really hadn't been done before. And the thing with Roy Acuff was, especially when it came to his gospel songs, he would sing with such sincerity that tears would often roll down his face. And that is honestly one of the most gorgeous things I think I've ever heard. You know, Acuff truly believed in these values that he was singing at, especially when it came to religion. And this is sort of the Tennessee, Nashville, the growth of that. Roy Acuff, the Carter family, Jimmie Rodgers, you had others as well. But the next big shift came out in Texas with things were a little different in Texas, especially once Prohibition had been repealed in 1933. During this time period, Texas was undergoing a bit of an oil boom, So you had a lot of these little, what were called honky-tonks, little tiny bars that would pop up. And one of the styles that developed from this was Texas swing. Now, a bit of the Texas swing era was born out of the singing cowboy. Gene Autry, Roy Rogers, that kind of thing. And especially during the Depression, the singing cowboy was really, really big because this guy was out doing his own thing. He was his own boss, working at his own pace, working his own hours. Just him, his guitar, his six-gun, serenading the woman and riding off into the sunset after beating the bad guys, who were often the big mine bosses or corrupt town political men. Yeah, go back and watch a lot of those old Gene Autry movies. But that was another big part of country music right there, was this sort of independent, I'll do my own thing mindset that would really grow in the 1970s in the outlaw country movement, but we'll get there. So Gene Autry and the Singing Cowboy, this kind of evolves into what's called Western swing. And anyone who's played Fallout New Vegas, you've heard Western swing. Think Rose of San Antone, for those of you who've heard that, or for those of you who have played Fallout New Vegas, think the song Lone Star. I can see that Lone Star from 1,000 miles away. And what makes Texas swing a little different is that it incorporated, just as the name might suggest, more jazz elements into it. And this was very popular, and the best example would be Bob Wills and the Texas Playboys. You also had the Light Crust Doughboys, you had the Sons of the Pioneers, who kind of walked the line between Texas swing and the Singing Cowboy group. But beginning in the mid-30s and into the early 40s, a bit of a rougher element was beginning to develop out of this barroom setting out in Texas. It was a much more rougher sounding country music, and this is the advent of what is called honky-tonk music. I got into this a little bit earlier, but now we're going to get into the meat of it. So this is where you get into people like Red Foley, Ernest Tubb, and Hank Williams, but we will get to that. And honky-tonk music was a little different in that it was, again, keeping that deeply personal theme that began even all the way back to Jimmie Rodgers. These were songs about divorce, about, having marital trouble, maybe you were, alcoholism. This was a side that country music really hadn't dealt with before. And what made this particularly unique is, again, a level of authenticity. And we're going to focus in on Ernest Tubb here. Ernest Tubb he owned a nightclub. He was a womanizer. He had marital troubles with his first wife, and he was singing songs about living that style of life. And again, this was really the beginning of what would turn into outlaw country, but we're not quite there yet. So what makes honky-tonk music different from Texas swing is the introduction of electrified instruments. You start getting a pedal steel guitar. You start getting electric guitars. You start getting microphones so they can cut through the noise of the bar room. And a lot of these bars they played, especially back then, were rough places. In an interview with Ray Price, I remember he said that he counted 26 individual fights going out on the dance floor at one time. Don Helms, Hank Williams' steel guitar player, said at one club in particular there were people inside shooting out and people outside shooting in. So these were very, very violent, chaotic places. I mean, you could get seriously hurt or even killed in these places. So you may have seen Roadhouse. They'll have chicken wire up on the stage. And the reason they have that up is in case people started throwing bottles. So out of this really came a much harder, much more, I guess, raw, you could say, sound in the honky-tonk style. And if you want a good early example of that, Ernest Tubb, Walking the Floor Over You. You have Red Foley, Hank Thompson, Hank Snow, Lefty Frizzell. These guys come a little later. But that brings us to about 1945. Now, we're going to get into probably the most important person in country music, and probably one of the most important in American music. So, beginning in 1945, there begins to be some buzz out of Alabama about a young singer coming up. And that singer is Hank Williams. Hank Williams Sr. is without a doubt the most important artist in American history, and we're going to get into why. Now, we've covered the Carter family, Jimmie Rodgers, Roy Acuff, Ernest Tubb, and we can see how all of these elements, from gospel elements, blues elements, the folk element, all of these have slowly combined and people have tweaked them until we get to this point. And Hank Williams is sort of the culmination of all of these elements rolled into one. In 1947, he has his first real big hit with Movin' On Over. And if you haven't listened to that song, go and listen to it, because that is what I consider to be the first rock and roll song. The very fast-paced driving bass compared to pretty much any sort of country music that had come before it. Even Acuff and Ernest Tubb and Red Foley and those guys, the honky-tonk guys, still didn't have the driving bass line, still didn't have an electric guitar playing at the speed. But again, it was very, very, let's see, what's a good word for it? Genuine. Because Hank's life was as chaotic as his music made it out to be, from his marital troubles with his first wife, Audrey. Most of the songs that you listen to about Hank Williams that have to deal with heartbreak and loss and infidelity are directly about his marriage to Audrey. And this is the biggest part of country music that unfortunately is dying today, and that is authenticity. The authenticity is what makes this music so beautiful, and Hank is just the shining example of it. He put all of his pain and grief into his music, and what came out of it is the most important body of work in American cultural history. If you listen to Movin' On Over, Moanin' the Blues, a lot of these are very, very early rock and roll, or at least you can see the influence that it would later have on rock and roll. The influence that Hank Williams had on pretty much everyone. He was the first country artist that had a song crossover into pop when Tony Bennett covered Cold Cold Heart. That was the first time that had ever happened. So, and this is 1949, 1950. Now, of course, you have Lovesick Blues. You have a bunch of other songs that were released by Hank in this time period. And again, this is the honky-tonk style of music. But Hank is a little different from Ernest Tubb in the sense that he combines Acuff's vocal style with Ernest Tubb's musical style. And if you listen, you can actually hear Ernest Tubb's phrasing in a lot of Hank's music. But he took all of this and combined it into proto-rock and roll. It still had a fiddle, it still had the pedal guitar, but it was only a couple of measures behind rock and roll in terms of its speed. And even today, everyone from heavy metal artists to people like Norah Jones, almost all of them have covered a Hank Williams song at one point. Bob Dylan, Dee Snider, Steve Earle, even Volbeat not long ago covered I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry. And a lot of these songs were written by Hank directly, whereas before, especially with the Carter family and Acuff, you were hearing songs that were 200, 300 years old that just hadn't been copyrighted. And don't get me wrong, I'm not discrediting. It's wonderful that these songs were preserved this way. But with Hank, it was really, really unique because he lived the life that he was singing about, as did other contemporary artists like Lefty Frizzell or Ray Price, who actually lived with Hank Williams for a time. And Ray Price has his own unique place in country music, and we'll get to him in a minute. But Hank Williams, after his divorce with Audrey in 1951, 1952, really began to fall apart. He had become addicted to painkillers due to an undiagnosed spinal condition, most likely spina bifida occulta. And according to Ray Price, he made a call to Audrey on New Year's Eve, 1952, and tried to get her to come back to him and said, "Audrey, if you don't come back to me, I'll die in a year." Well, exactly 1 year later, on New Year's Eve, 1952, or New Year's Day, 1953, No one's really sure which. Hank had been kind of partying. It was New Year's Eve. He had been drinking heavily. That was another consistent problem with Hank was his alcoholism. It eventually got him fired from the Grand Ole Opry, who had grown at this time to be sort of the mecca of country music. And if you've ever been to the Ryman Auditorium, I have. If you haven't, you need to go. It is architecturally, it is one of the most beautiful buildings I think I've ever seen. But Hank gets fired from the Opry due to his drinking, and again, due to a growing morphine addiction, due to his bad back. The doctor he had at the time supposedly didn't have a real license, and on New Year's Eve 1953, he allegedly shot him up with too much morphine, and either that night, New Year's Eve 1952, or New Year's Day 1953, Hank Williams died in the back of his Cadillac in what I believe was Point Pleasant, West Virginia, heading to a singing date in Canton, Ohio. He was 29 years old at the time. And his body of work that he left behind, again, formed not only the bedrock of what you would consider as modern country music, but also formed the bedrock of rock and roll, and inspired pretty much every other genre to come out of it, to come after him. And that is why I say Hank Williams is one of the most important artists in American history. The Carter family often being an unsung hero for the preservation of these wonderful early American ballads. Roy Acuff for his beautiful, sincere style of singing, and his preservation of that vocal style and the ballads and songs that he recorded. Bob Wells introduced jazz elements. Jimmy Rogers introduced blues elements. But Hank Williams, again, took blues elements from a black street performer named Rufus Payne, and he was actually the one who taught Hank how to play the guitar. But I forgot to mention that, and I really shouldn't have, because that was another big importance. So Hank took the blues influence, he took the folk influence from the Carter family and Acuff, he took the influence from Bob Wells and the Texas Playboys, and he took the influence from the likes of Ernest Tubb and Red Foley, and managed to create a whole new style of country music that was no longer just honky-tonk. It was no longer just the white man's blues. It was no longer just folk. He had invented true country music, taking it out of the sort of hokey, orchestrated way that the Grand Ole Opry would have you look at it, and made it real. And that's what is so special about Hank Williams is you can listen to his songs if you're having, trouble in your life. And it's like he's taking the words out of your own heart and singing them back to you. And that was a cornerstone of country music. All the greats, from Johnny Cash to George Strait, all of them managed to encapsulate that in some way. But with the death of Hank Williams and the beginning of rock and roll, really begins the decline. But we will get to the post-rock and roll era in a later video. So guys, that is it for today. Be sure to let me know what you thought down in the comments below. Be sure to go and listen to those songs I recommended, guys. I've been the Albino Jackass. Thanks for listening to me, hee-haw. Enjoy the video, guys. Again, be sure to like, comment, share, subscribe, all that good noise. Have a great day. See you in the next video. Peace out, players.